and this is from my own personal experience, when things were starting to get tight and if they booked back-to-back surgeries that I couldn't accommodate, I would go to the nurse manager. We would look at the schedule. We would talk to the surgeons, get the okay. But if you don't take the opportunities, the answer is always going to be no.
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal: to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
Hey there, clean freaks. Hank Balch in studio with you today for this episode of the Beyond Clean podcast. Today we're going to be talking about turnovers, what they are, why they matter, and how to get them right in SPD. These are some complex processes and situations. I'll tell you what, a lot of it has to do with your team, with the amount of time you have, with the equipment, and the setup that you have in your departments, and so much more. There's a lot of moving parts when it comes to turnover. So we're going to dive into that today with our guest, Rebecca Lauber. And we'll be right back in studio with her after a really short break. Hang with us, and we'll talk to you soon.
I'm Bobby Parker.
And I'm Hank Balch.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
All right, clean freaks, we're in studio now with Rebecca Lauber, the regional trainer at Surgical Solutions and a member of our Beyond Clean advisory group. You've probably seen her stuff online if you pay attention to any of the pop art style AI graphics. They're on LinkedIn. She's also written some blog articles for us through the Beyond Clean blog. So if you're subscribed to the newsletter, you may have seen that as well. But we got Rebecca in studio today to talk about a pretty important topic that I think touches just about every department out there in the universe, and that is turnovers, instrument turnovers in SPD. So Rebecca, welcome to the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's an honor. Anytime that we get any member of the Beyond Clean advisory group, just gives me another excuse to talk about how awesome that group is and how many amazing just all-stars we have. And so it's a cool opportunity to kind of get two birds with one stone. Love to talk to you in particular, but then also to spotlight the entire group and just all the wonderful ideas that are coming out of that right now. So we're talking about turnovers today. Just to ready, set again, I've kind of been doing this almost at the beginning of all of these episodes. The previous seasons here in 2024 have been, we started the year talking about the roles that make us great. And we went through all the different job titles that are common within sterile processing. Then we talked about the paper that makes us awesome. And we talked about the different types of paperwork, from IFUs to job descriptions to whatnot. Then just the previous season, we talked about the little things that make a big difference in sterile processing. But this season is the processes that save lives. And I wanted to take a step back and really dig into maybe the big things. Like last season, it was the little things, still had a big impact, but these are the big things that it's going to be rare for you not to encounter one of these things every single day in the average sterile processing department. And obviously, as I've alluded to, turnovers is one of those things. So we're going to talk about that today. But before we do, let's get to know you a little bit more, Rebecca. What's your backstory? How'd you get into sterile processing? What do you love about this industry?
So, hi, my name's Rebecca, and I got into this industry, been in this industry since 2016. So I was an EMT firefighter, great state of Delaware, and I saw a job description that was saying you would be doing with instrument trays, but you have to be okay with biohazard in blood. And I said, well, I'm already okay with that.
Right.
I
Nice.
seen it all. So I applied. They were a bit weary because, I wasn't in the industry yet, but I wanted to find more growth within the healthcare system. And thankfully, I got the job and the rest is history.
Wow. So do you, kind of comparing the two, obviously, well, I guess three, because, firefighting and EMT, those themselves are different roles, right? But between the three of those, any surprises or comparisons maybe between the three that you didn't realize that you would be able to use the same type of skill set in SPD coming from that background?
So when you're an EMT firefighter, it's all about, time. You're always under tension. Every second counts. And I was actually surprised to see that when we are as sterile processing technicians, every second counts for us as well. The clock starts ticking once those instruments get into decontam, because as we're talking about turnover time, they're needed for the next surgery and we might not have enough inventory. So we have to stay on top of everything, but we also have to be sure that we're following the standards and guidelines and IFUs for these instrumentations.
That's cool. And I guess you, as a firefighter, you get to carry a big axe. And then for sterile processing, we still have some sharp tools, no big axes, but there's some saws out there. Are you originally from Delaware, or you were just living in Delaware when you got the EMT job?
Born, raised Delaware, worked for Magnolia Fire Department, and then I moved around quite a lot. I worked in Florida. Then I became a traveler for a few years during the pandemic to see what the world was doing during the pandemic.
And to make a lot of money too, right?
Yeah, just a little bit of money, but I also saw we know traveling.
Yeah.
And then I found myself settling in New Jersey, and then officially settling in the great state of Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Where I'm at now.
Very cool. Yeah, my wife is from Delaware, and so meeting anyone else from Delaware, there's 3 counties, so the chances are pretty high that you're going to end up knowing somebody's family or whatever else. So,
being from there is so funny. There's a rep, because I work in New York City, so that I have one rep that I worked with, and he's like, he texted me something, and he's like, "Oh my God, you have a 302 number?" Which is the only area code in Delaware.
Okay.
And he's like, "Oh my God, where are you from?" And it was just like, I don't know, reminiscing on all these things Delaware. It's so silly, but it's like a familiarity there.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. That's completely different from Texas, where I don't know how many counties we have, but it takes 7 hours to get from border to border. So yeah, kind of opposite ends of the spectrum there. But anyways, to the topic at hand, turnovers. Before we get too deep into all the nuances, let's just try to define the term. If you were explaining this to maybe a new technician or even someone kind of outside of the surgical setting, how would you define turnover?
So I'd like to think of turnover as resetting the stage for each surgery that's going to need that instrumentation. So it starts as soon as we know a tray is needed. It can be fast-paced, but it's all about being thorough. So we're not rushing to compromise safety. So if I was sitting here telling a new technician, I would just say a turnover tray is a tray that is in high demand. And as soon as we see this tray, it needs to be turned over and processed from start to finish.
So really interesting definitions there, right? You went to kind of the resetting piece. I really like that analogy that you use, right? It's like, this is not a different kind of thing that we're doing to this tray. This is the same thing that we did to the tray the first time. Now we're just doing it under a little bit tighter time constraints. It doesn't mean that we're going quicker, to your point. It just means now we've got a deadline that we're meeting with the processing of this tray. I think that's a really important descriptor there and what this is and what it's not. And we'll talk more about that here in a second. You kind of alluded to this, but I want to call this out too. Why do turnovers happen in the first place? And when do they happen in the sterile processing, like day-to-day workflow, schedule, et cetera?
So you're going to hear this a little later on, but when it comes to turnover, it has to do with, it could be anywhere from scheduling, add-ons, any form of inventory, poor inventory management, or one of the best things, it's not really good, but when something is compromised in the OR, and if you don't have enough inventory, then you're now rushing a tray to go through its process. But I'm always talking about, and those who know me on LinkedIn, I always talk about communication. So, and that's a very big part of turnaround time.
Great. Yeah. We'll talk about communication. I absolutely agree, right? Like that's kind of make or break. And that's why it's definitely something that we want to cover here later. To reference something though, too, that I think is really important again, as we're building, maybe we'll call it a philosophy of turnover management. I don't know if that's the best description, but that's the one that we're going to work with here. The idea that, sometimes you can know you're having turnovers long before the day's even started, right? Like, the night before, the day before, because you look at the surgery schedule, to your point, and you can tell, oh, well, we got 4 of these surgeries today, and we got 2 of these trays. So we know at the very least, there's going to be 2 turnovers. That was one example that you kind of gave there. And then you got another scenario where perhaps you didn't know there was going to be a turnover until, the case was getting set up to begin. And then they realize we've got a contaminated tray, and then perhaps there's no backups. And then boom, this timeline starts on the turnover process. So let me ask you, and I guess this is kind of a softball question now that we've answered some of these questions the way that you have, but are turnovers inherently problematic or negative? Why or why not?
So let's think about turnovers. Turnovers happen often between surgeries to make sure instruments are sterile and safe for the next use. And yeah, there's some things that happen in between there. Let's take the example of a contaminated tray. We don't have enough inventory. Sometimes they start pulling from other cases, case cards from, surgeries that are going to be happening in the next few hours. And now that's causing even a bigger turnaround time for all those instruments as well. So these problems really, they arise when we're short on time and inventory, and it could lead to pressure and the rush of the process. It can become problematic, but what's more problematic is when the corners are cut and patient safety is at risk.
I'm trying to think of which one to go to next because I want to ask you about cutting corners, but I got another question I want to ask you first. Let's just go cutting corners, and then I'll try to remember the other one. So you're right. One of the most problematic aspects of turnovers is because of the time pressure, that temptation to cut corners. So give us a couple examples, and everyone listening in who's a sterile processing tech, they already know what you're about to say, but give us a couple of examples of how and where the corners can get cut in the turnover process. And this is non-compliant. I guess they're all non-compliant because you're cutting corners. So what are some of these non-compliant things that happen or that folks are tempted to do to meet this timeline?
So we'll go with, the good old classic dunk. So you just put the instruments in, spray it off with the sprayer, throw it in the washer. Or I've seen in my lifetime that going straight to the window, straight through the pass-through window. Or they'll do it in the ultrasonic. They won't have the instrument soaking for long enough time. Once it gets over to the prep side, you have quick assemblies, not counting on the count sheets, not making sure all the instruments are even in that tray. I've seen that. And Our favorite flash packs, IUSS, one tray.
Of course. Right. Yeah. So that's really the whole process, right? Like, you got cutting corners on the manual cleaning. Yeah. Potentially skipping complete corners on the automated cleaning, to your point. You're cutting corners in the assembly inspection process. And then depending on the sterilization method or that process, you could be doing some kind of immediate use, not in a emergent scenario, but just because of the time constraints. So going back, so those are the examples again of potentially cutting corners in the process. I do want to ask though, on what regular turnovers tell us about our inventory if we're seeing in that meeting the night before, every time we have that meeting, but we know, okay, tomorrow we're going to turn this over 2 times, just because of the volume of the surgeries that we're scheduling and because of the number of inventory that we have in SPD. When you see that happening on a regular basis, you just told us earlier, hey, they're not necessarily inherently problematic as long as we're not cutting corners. If that's true, do you address that issue of the inventory versus the surgical volume? Or is it not worth addressing until we start seeing those pressures become so much that, again, we start leading to non-compliance and the reprocessing? Is there a line somewhere in between there that we need to be thinking about?
So I'm a firm believer in data analysis. We have to be capturing the data in our operating rooms and our sterile processing units when it comes to volume and turnover time, just as much as the OR is getting metrics for volume, on-time start, turnover time, and cancellations, all this type of data that they're looking for. We also need to be looking at that type of data. How long does it take to prep these trays? How much trays do we have? What is the cost versus, having to turn over this tray? Because I would love looking at trends. And I got my Lean Six Sigma green belt.
Hey, congrats.
Yes, thank you. I got my Lean Six Sigma green belt. And this was actually a part of that green belt. One surgeon that loved to do ureteroscopies and all that stuff. But this one tray, I had to keep borrowing from across the city. So I started following that tray and multiple trays, but that tray in particular costs, to get 2 more, which is what I needed in my inventory, it would only cost $600. But to get it across from the city and get it back to the facility it belonged to, it cost $800 every time I did it. And if I did those surgeries multiple times a week, that adds up when I just spent $600 to get 2 more trays. So it's all about, we have to weigh the causes and the volume and the trends that we're seeing in our ORs and see where we can make changes. But we don't want to wait until it becomes a problem. Once we start getting to that turnover process where we're turning over this tray so much, we need to start thinking about increasing that inventory.
Right. Okay. A good answer. I like that answer because we need to look at data. It's not a black and white. It's not an easy answer because it's not an easy problem. And I really like that example, obviously, that you use from real life that, hey, sometimes the cost, if you can identify it, it's going to make the case very clearly for you that, hey, let's just buy some more of these trays. And I know another alternative, which is, it's challenging. So I'm going to say this, and I understand that, some people may hear this and be like, oh, I don't even want to think about trying to do that. But there are scenarios where if you talk to your OR manager, if you talk to your surgeon, if you talk to your schedulers, you can figure out some different scheduling arrangements that can reduce that pressure on your limited inventory sometimes. And it's not because the surgeon can only work on that day. It's just that's the only day that they've been scheduled, or that's the only block that they've been given. But if it's turning into some of these issues and challenges around turnovers or instrument availability, there could be some other things you could do from the scheduling side as well. So I just want to call that out for anybody who's trying to work through this.
You took the words right out of my mouth.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I'm such, in my conversation, I always talk about synchronized level of care in our operating rooms. The OR and SPD should be synchronized at all times. I'm a front leader, so what I love to do, I love to talk to the surgeons. I love talking to the nurse managers, surgical techs, and there's a lot to learn from speaking with them and understanding their roles. So, and this is from my own personal experience, when things were starting to get tight, and if they booked back-to-back surgeries that I couldn't accommodate, I would go to the nurse manager. We would look at the schedule. We would talk to the surgeons, get the okay. But if you don't take the opportunities, answer is always going to be no.
Right. So speaking of the answer always being no, when we get the request for a turnover in SPD, it's not really a request, right? It's not a question that we can say yes or no to. The answer is yes, we can turn this over, but then it comes in our court, and then the process is our process to say, but if we're going to turn this over, this is how it's going to happen. This is the process the tray is going to go through. And then from the OR side or the surgeon side, this is what you should expect when this tray gets back to you. So here, real briefly, can you just give us a quick thumbnail sketch of what a compliant turnover process should look like from beginning to end? Let's maybe start with a tray that has been contaminated in the operating room. Maybe they open it up and there's a hole in the wrapper, and then they get the call. So start from there.
So we get this call. Tray contaminated, but we need this tray turned over right now. Okay, so how I get the call. How soon do you need it? Okay, they give me that time frame. Let's say they reschedule it. I'm gonna give you the latest. So let's say they rescheduled this person. Okay, 4-hour turnaround. 4-hour turnaround for those trays if you went through the full entire process. However, when I'm speaking to that person, I'm letting them know the turnaround time, the person who's going to be in charge of this, and the process at every stage. So, like, for instance, if it came down to decontam, how long does the manual cleaning take, and how long does the automated washer? Okay, once these processes are done, we call up into the OR. Hey, just letting you know, 45 minutes in the washer. It's in the washer right now, and we just go step by step until the whole process is complete. And we're always keeping this open communication with the OR. Now, if we're talking about things like one tray or IUSS, because sometimes those patients don't get scheduled out, they're still in that surgery. I do ask, is there a tray that can replace that tray that you can use? If you aren't able to find a comparable or substituted tray, then I give them the realistic, I ask them what stage in the surgery are they at. So I really try and get into that surgery without being upstairs so that I can see where we're at in the process and where we need to be.
And you're asking those questions because the more information that you can get, number one, the better that you're able to communicate expectations back to them. But then number two, it helps you drive different decision trees basically in SPD for if we're going to package this, if so, how we're going to package it. And again, there are different workflows it can take. Okay. I got a feeling I know at least one of the things that's going to be on this list that I'm going to ask you on this next question, but what would you say are 3 things that are top priority in getting this process right in the context of turnovers?
So the 3 things, first thing is planning, knowing what trays are needed and when. Second, communication between the OR and sterile processing.
That's the one I thought.
Yeah, hey, you know me. Sterile processing teams and keeping everything coordinated. And third, And I already mentioned this, using data to manage your inventory and avoid shortages, because by tracking tray usage, we can ensure a fully stocked and avoid last minute rushes.
Planning, communication, data. I love it. If you know what's coming, you can plan accordingly. No matter what, either way, if you know it's coming or not, you need to communicate through the process, as you said. And then the data is going to tell that overarching story to help us actually plan better and communicate better. And it's kind of that reoccurring circle. They're great priorities. I think that's really important. Speaking of communication, this is kind of, I don't know, corrective action is probably not the right category to put this in. But if we mess up a turnover, which inevitably happens, goes to decontam and it goes into the black hole, and maybe it was lunchtime or someone took a break and they weren't in there when the turnover came in. Like, there's a million different things that can happen, which is one of the reasons why sterile processing is so complex. But if one of those things happen on a turnover and we just completely drop the ball, what can or should we do to recover trust in our operating room customer? Like, once that's complete, right? Like, I'm not talking about in the moment. Obviously, in the moment, you know what you do. You got to pick it up and go. But then after that, and the dust has settled, what would your advice be to recover that lost trust? Because I got to think every time you do that, the OR is just like, oh my goodness, here we go again.
Here we go again. And this shouldn't surprise anybody who knows me, but the best way is to just be honest and upfront, point blank. So things go wrong. Not everything is always going to go as smoothly as we want it to be. But if we own it and communicate it properly, work on getting a quick fix, not quick that compromises patient safety, of course, but again, I keep bringing up data, and that's really for, you can get data. You don't have to have the most intricate system to gather data. You have SPM out there, you have SensaTrack, you have the Ascenco's SQ-Track now, but you don't need all of these fancy systems to gather that, to be holding people accountable. So accountability is key, in just being transparent to build that trust, because mistakes are going to happen, but it's how we handle them that shows that commitment to the safety and teamwork.
I think that accountability piece, great point there. You do want to own it, and it's important. What you didn't say is tell them like who did it wrong, right? Or try to make some excuse about like where the OR dropped the ball, because they may have dropped the ball too in the process. But instead, it's, take accountability, communicate the plan, what the fix is, right? So like, what are we going to do in the future moving forward? How we're going to fix this process so that this doesn't happen again. I think the only other thing maybe that I would add to nuance this, and this is true not only for like turnover issues, but any issue that your customer in the OR is like, hey, how are you going to fix this so that it never happens again? You're really like, they're putting you in an impossible position in that scenario. Just like Rebecca said, we're human. Mistakes are going to happen. And you want to be really, really careful as a leader, as a technician, to not make promises that you can't keep, to not write checks that your butt can't cash, that kind of thing. Just be wary. Like, in the moment, you're going to want to be like, this is never going to happen again, doctor. I promise. Well, you make one of those promises and then it happens again next week, and the trust that you lost is like 10 times what you would have lost if you just would have been transparent and open and honest, like Rebecca said. So I think it's really, really important to stay measured, truthful, own the decision, be accountable, but don't overpromise that this thing is never, ever going to happen again. And I bet my life on it, because we just cannot control the process. And, many of these fixes, they take time. So we are at the end of our time. But before I let you go, because as you said, you've been working on these kinds of challenges and projects, not only in your career in sterile processing, but even in your projects around your Six Sigma cert. What else have you thought about like related to turnovers? Are there any other parting thoughts that you think folks in our industry should continue to work on, to talk through, maybe even to argue about? Is there anything that you want to leave out there, for folks to chew on as we wrap here?
Well, going back to what we were just talking about with how we handle things, you made a brief mention about not putting out that person's name, the person who, made that mistake. We don't want to do that. That actually breaks down trust within our department as well as with the OR, because they see that kind of behavior is what's being presented to them. And I'm working on an article about the ethical challenges in sterile processing and how rushing and skipping these steps can lead to those serious consequences. But I just want to leave with this. Take a moment in your day-to-day when you're at work and go to the OR, speak to a nurse manager, surgical tech, anything, and just advocate for, a day in the life. Understand their roles and their experiences through their eyes so that helps build that empathy and makes sure the team is cohesive. So that's very, very important to understand our different roles and how we can work together.
Awesome. We'll be looking for that article. Depending on when you're tuning into this episode, the article could already be out. So you may have to look around for it. But if you Google Rebecca's name, I'm sure you can track it down. And I'll call out too, like we talked about the calling out individuals piece. Like I know you just brought that up again, Rebecca. And I think that's a topic that I haven't seen a lot of conversation or content around. So if anyone's listening and you're like, you know what, I want to think some more about that anonymous piece, like the importance of anonymity in doing these corrective actions or these fixes or these responses to breakdowns in our department, like why that's so critical to guard the trust and to manage, teamwork and everything else. And of course, like some of this may be in your article already too, Rebecca, but I'd love to see more. I think it'd be a really, really interesting presentation or blog article to really dive into the aspects of that. So that's some homework to everybody else tuning in. But Rebecca, thank you for killing this interview. Terrific insight on this topic. I know we just scratched the surface. There's a lot more to talk about turnover. We'll put your contact info in the show notes so folks can reach out to you if they have any other questions or comments about this episode. But I really appreciate your time today.
I appreciate you too, Hank.
All right. That was Rebecca Lauber, the Regional Trainer for Surgical Solutions. And like I said, she's a member of the Beyond Clean Advisory Group. A lot of great work going on there. If you got some questions about the group, I'm sure Rebecca would love to answer some of those as well. And for everybody else tuning in, I hope you're enjoying this season of the Processes That Save Lives. It's been a lot of great conversations so far. We're not quite done yet. Got a couple more episodes in store for you this year. And if you got other topics or other people that you think should be on the show, we'd love to hear from you. Please reach out and email us, or you can comment through any of our pages on LinkedIn and Facebook. But until we talk to you then, like we say each and every week here at Beyond Clean, keep fighting dirt.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for Beyond Clean in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. We look forward to hearing from you.